it says agronomist up there. I'm mostly a soil scientist by training, but I think Mark and Tance did a great job this morning talking about soil, so I'll be kind of a heavy crop focus today. I'm also the manager of the West River Research Farm, and some of you might be saying, West River Research Farm? Yeah, so we opened that two or 3 years ago. It's just east of Sturgis, and so we haven't done a great job publishing it and getting it out to the public, but we're there and we're operational, and so every year I think we're getting more and more data, and we're trying to get into the swing of things out there. So you know, you can see the title there, Crop Options for Diversity. That was Ruth gave me that topic to discuss. And so I'm going to talk about some stuff, mostly other people's work. So you might have seen some of it here and there, but it's and some of it is dated. But if you're like me, you need repetition to remember these things. Before I do that, as a little bit of prologue, I had a couple things I wanted to touch on. Dennis kind of stole my thunder here. There's not much thunder here, really. But this is just the drought monitor. This is South Dakota from a year ago and this week. So you can see things have changed. Let me see if I can. Whoops. The trigger. Whoops. The big red button there. There it is. Yeah, obviously last year we were in a worse spot than we are this year. But, you know, the only change is that it's a bit drier in this northwest corner than it is this year. So what does that mean? You know, I think Dennis gave a pretty classic answer. Is it going to rain? Is it not going to rain? Yes. So, you know, it is what it is. You can take that information and use it as you will, but it's a bit drier in the northwest corner. So the other thing that seems to be taking up a lot of bandwidth these days is fertilizer prices, and so I just wanted to touch on this briefly and give a little bit of some context. So this is going back to 2008. You can see this light blue line here is liquid UAN. This dark blue line is the dry urea, and this green line here is anhydrous. And so this is why people are talking these days. And you've all seen this. So right now, prices are hovering at $95 to $1.10 per pound of nitrogen, and that changes. I mean, it looks like possibly that's peaked. I don't know. I'm not an economist. That's one of my favorite answers. But you know, who knows? Your guess is as good as mine. But you know, some of these things, MAP is up 72%, urea 148%, UAN 179%. So you've all seen this stuff. The thing I wanted to, whoops, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is a graph that I just put together the other day. And basically what I did was take the average over this 1992 to 2022 of these different inputs and outputs. You got the price of wheat, price of corn, price of oil, price of urea fertilizer. So 2 of those you're receiving and 2 of those you're paying. And basically, if you look at this, this is the percent change over that 30-year average. And the thing that kind of jumps out is our inputs are increasing on a steeper rate than our outputs, our wheat and corn price. So, you know, what these trends show, it increases by about 4% for oil and nitrogen and about 3% for wheat and corn. If you look at the actual data, it kind of goes all like this all over. But this is just, if you kind of detrend it, this is kind of what it looks like over the long term. So this is one more, just a quick one. I like this graph. This shows basically the cost of applying fertilizer to these different crops. So this is your dollars per planted acre here on this x-axis. On this x-axis is the fertilizer as a percent of the cost. So obviously corn's expensive to plant relative to wheat, oats, barley. But really the fertilizer cost as a percent of your operating costs is roughly the same in the mid-30s, 35%. Of course, you all know what that is to your operation specifically, but it's a sizable proportion. So one thing I wanted to do, though, is look at what this might mean for some of our work around here. And so this is this is we did some nitrogen response curves. We're always doing these, but this is over the time frame from 2017 to 2019, right here in Wall. And so this is kind of a typical nitrogen response curve with winter wheat. And you see here, it's kind of messy, you know. These are your nitrogen rates here. This is your yield here on the y-axis. And there's a big spread around each of these. It's kind of like when you drive across with your combine, you look at the yield monitor, it bounces around. And so we're covering, this is 3 years, and so every year is going to have a different potential, but then you're going to have different variability within the field itself. So the way to make sense of this is to try to fit some sort of curve. So we can try to figure out what are acceptable rates, and what does that mean maybe for dollars and cents. And so this is kind of the best fitting curve that we've seen. There's a few characteristics that are really important about this graph that kind of speak to nitrogen efficiency. So first off, you can see it increases to a point where you have this hinge point, and then it stops. It essentially goes flat. So that hinge point is pretty important. It's called the agronomic optimum, where basically what you're saying is applying any more nitrogen after, in this case, 118 pounds, 65 bushels, is about what you're going to get for these studies. So applying any more nitrogen over 118 pounds is not going to return any more wheat. The other thing about this that you can see readily is that this curve is steeper down here, which means you make more wheat down here than you do up when you start to make this curve. I can highlight that. I mean, if you go from 0 to 40 pounds, you say you're about at 35 pounds here, add 40 pounds, and you go up to a little over 50. So maybe 16, 17 bushels of wheat by adding this first 40 pounds. You go from 40 to 80, then you go from, say, 52 up to a little over 60. So now the next 40 pounds, we got 10 pounds of wheat. So it's decreasing as you go. So the whole point is you can take these curves and you can basically see, based on the price of wheat and based on the price of corn, what is my most efficient rate? You're never going to be able to guess this beforehand. All we're doing is prognosticating here. But the best that we can do is say, okay, so when you take some prices that you can use, I'll show you on the next slide, but we can come down, 22 pounds, and we only lose a bushel here of wheat. So it's much more economically efficient. So I wrote this out, sorry for the math, but it's me doing it, so it's pretty basic math. So basically, at the agronomic optimum, if I use a standard price of 52 cents for a pound of nitrogen and $5 for a bushel of wheat, you can argue with me what prices to use. But at 118 pounds, 65 bushels, you get $263. Okay, so looking at the economic optimum based on those same prices, said it was 96 pounds, it actually jumps up to 270. So on that particular curve, you can drop your rate and save yourself $7. So now, as I mentioned, today it's different. So if I look at those same things, now I'm looking at $1.10, that's on the high side. That would be, I guess, the UAN price based on that graph, and $7.50 for wheat. So this is a ratio of 0.15 from nitrogen to wheat. So when I put that in there, the new economic optimum is 84 pounds, which gives you a whole lot more money this year. At the old economic optimum, it's slightly less by $6. And then I put in, if you have $5 wheat and you had the same nitrogen price, here's what it looks like. It's a totally different economic optimum. It drops down to 68 pounds at the $5 wheat price. And if you didn't put any nitrogen down, you'd be at 255. That's at 750. So what am I trying to say here? There's a couple things. Yes, you can come down on your nitrogen, but no, I don't think you should cut out nitrogen entirely, because as you can see, the price of wheat has gone up by a substantial amount. So even though the prices of nitrogen are high, I don't think it's good to just to cut it off by substantial portions. So what are the caveats to that? The first one, I'm not an economist. But the second one is that if we don't have rain, that line back there flattens out. It's going to happen anyway. So whether you put down nitrogen or not, that's something we deal with every other year. What else do you think? What are the other caveats to these types of things when you're trying to predict nitrogen rates?
Protein. Yeah.
Protein, great point. So all of these, if I'm saying back off your nitrogen, you could be backing off on your protein too. And so then I'll let Jerry talk about if protein is going to matter this year. But typically, it's not if you're high, it's if you're low, if you're below 12%. And in wall, I know we have a heck of a time trying to get 12% sometimes, even at our high rates. And so, if people back off on their nitrogen, maybe you might speculate that, protein's going to be low anyway. I don't know. But certainly there is that protein premium and discount that you have to consider. And again, that would lend to the argument that maybe I shouldn't cut too much, but something to consider. Any other thoughts? So the point, though, backing up, is that we can back off a little bit, though, and we still maintain yields. Now, protein, that's another issue. So I'm going to switch gears. Maybe the transition there would be that we have this backdrop of a whole bunch of things that we can't control, weather, prices. So what are the things we can control? And one of the things we control is our rotations. And this is where I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about. And like I said, these are some older studies, both here in the Wall area and then some going east towards Dakota Lakes. Dwayne shared a few slides. But one thing we know for sure is that our rotations, the wider we get, the more diverse we get, typically the more stable our yields are. And so one thing you can do is maybe you can't control the weather, you can't control the prices, but at least you can make your operation more stable. And we can talk about a lot of these different rotations. But you can see this is a study going back, this is in the Wall area just south of the interstate. Maybe some of you saw that when it was going on. But they ran this study from 1993 to 2009. And so these are the majority of the rotations here, winter wheat fallow. They had some millet rotations. And as you can see, going down, it gets more and more diverse. So some of the interesting things they found, first off, there were 4 rotations that never changed through that entire study period. So that was 16 years that this ran. And so these are the yields from 96. So basically, one cycle through that rotation, and then they started monitoring the yield. So they let it kind of settle in, and then they start mapping this stuff out. And so the 4 that never changed through this entire time, you have the wheat fallow rotation, 48 bushels, of course 0 in the fallow, 34 bushels in the wheat millet. I'm mostly focusing on the winter wheat here, by the way. 40 bushels in this wheat safflower millet, 42 bushels in the wheat corn millet. So just throw it out there. If you look at these 4 rotations, which one looks appealing? Maybe none of them look appealing, I don't know.
4.
Number 4, wheat safflower millet. Why do you say that?
Equal wheat, you get 60 more pounds millet, and then safflower crop, I guess, is something.
Safflower something, yeah. What's that?
Broadleaf.
It's a broadleaf, yeah. So that's, first off, you have wheat fallow, so that's 50% high residue. You have wheat millet, that's 100% high residue. You have wheat corn millet, 100% high residue. And then you have this two high residue, 1 low residue, so 66%. So there's a lot of things to consider in here. Obviously, 48 bushels is going to be your highest. This field, by the way, was pretty rough. 1.2%, 1.4% organic matter. So it had been farmed pretty hard for about 60 years prior to that. So they had kind of lower yields in general. But yeah, you might as well just cut that in half. And I don't think we need to get into the fallow discussion as much. But wheat millet, you can see a big drop here compared to these two. Any guesses as to what happened here? Disease, definitely. Yeah, the other big thing is weeds really got to them. The diseases that show up though, because they bounce back and forth, are those in the crown roots mostly. So they had a lot of fusarium root rots and things that really hurt that yield. So this is the winter wheat yields from 99 to 2009. And so you have this winter wheat fallow again. This is their longest rotation. It was a 6-year rotation. Winter wheat sunflower millet, winter wheat corn fallow. So there's 2 of these here. So winter wheat would be the first, this yield here would be the one following the fallow. This one here would be the one following the millet. And so you see a big drop off between the 2, but really, just if you just compare where the only fallows are, coming out to 1 year and 6 versus 1 year and 2, they actually increase their yields. And then these are all, relatively similar. And then you have that wheat millet that really fell off. It was just too tight of a rotation. So some of the other crops that they had in here, representative yields for the area: safflower, just over 1,000 pounds. Sunflower behind wheat versus sunflower behind corn. Likely candidate there just because you have a longer recharge period there. Field peas, this is certainly much lower than what we typically see out here. And then this is their millet and their corn. So, and this is some of just the kind of the summary of what they concluded from this. Winter wheat in good 3-year rotations yields 85% of black fallow. Winter wheat in 2-year rotations yield 20% than wheat in 3-year rotations. Adding broadleaves help reducing disease pressure from crown and root rots. This one I'm not entirely sure about. This was a slide from John Rickerson, who many of you may know. The 2 years of wheat and 2 years out was not enough time to take care of a lot of the weed problems. And I'll show some other data that suggests that might be otherwise. And we can discuss that further. But this one too, it took 8 to 10 years to really see no-till improve soil structure. So you're playing the long game here. Any questions on that? Okay. So at that same time, there was a guy, Rand Anderson, that did a lot of weed work out with these rotations. And I wanted to put up a slide. I think it's based off of some of his ideas. And I tried to pick kind of the weeds that are probably most problematic in our area. I'm sure there's a few others that people deal with. But the point really, when you start to look at these, is when you start to look at the physiology of these things, the point is, if I put in here, there's roughly 3 peaks. And these are windows. These are not just simple deadlines, but 3 peaks here where you see weed emergence. And so you get your winter annuals here, your mare's tail or horseweed, cheatgrass, early spring kosher Russian thistle, and then later on in the season foxtail and pigweeds and various other things. So I think a lot of what they figured out, or what they discovered over working with these different crops, is, for example, winter wheat is not the time to be dealing with mare's tail. It's not the time to be dealing with downy brome. You got to take care of that in the extended part of your rotation. And if I put in, sorry, this gets a little bit messy, but here's various planting dates. And so if you're looking at just from a weed perspective and you're looking at your rotations, when are the times that you can catch this stuff? Kochia and Russian thistle, you can catch a little, maybe the first flush here, but really the opportunity to catch Kochia and Russian thistle is in your corn, sorghum, and even later into your sunflowers. Pigweeds, foxtail, that's best taken care of. Sometimes you can take care of it with your winter wheat harvest because it's still flowering at that time. But also, this is a great time to take care of that is earlier or in this late summer period, late spring period, or else you can take care of it post application or post harvest with your cool season weeds, cool season grasses like winter wheat. Annual forages like Tance talked about, it's a great time to take care of a lot of your weed issues too. Let the cows eat them. So this is some of the data though that they collected when they were going through these rotational studies looking at some of the weed emergence. Basically what they would do is within each of those rotations they put a tarp down and then they'd go and spray whatever herbicide they were spraying, and then they'd take the tarp out, and then a couple different times during the year they'd count the weeds. And so kind of like what we already talked about, here's this wheat millet rotation, weed community 225 plants per square meter. 143 of those were downy brome and 46 were kochia, so heavily dominated by brome and kochia. And I know that continues to be an issue still today. So what do you see from these other ones? Certainly weed community is cut in half and sometimes 2/3 or more by many of these rotations. But the basic point is the longer rotations you have, the more options you have for weed control. And you can use more modes of action. This is another nice graph looking at the weed density. So this is the ratio of cool season crops to warm season crops. So wheat fallow here, 30 plants per square meter. And this again is that wheat millet 1-to-1 ratio. So obviously the highest. And the whole take-home message here is that the more cool seasons to warm season, the bigger ratio that you can get, or excuse me, the higher number within the ratio. The ratio itself doesn't really matter, but the more you have in that rotation, the better your weed control gets. One thing I should add is from 1999, 2001 here, we do have a lot better weed options that they didn't have at this time, but we're still dealing with a lot of these same issues. Is there anyone I guess I'm curious about your thoughts on these. As you expand your rotations, what do you see as effective? What do you see for effective weed control? Is it all herbicides? Does rotation itself have any effect? I think certainly you're covering the ground, especially at different times in the year. One other thing that is kind of emerging as theory is the more diversity in weeds that you have, the easier they are to control, which you're saying, well, the more weeds I have, the easier they are to control. Sounds kind of counterintuitive, but really what it is the number of species that you have, they utilize resources differently. And so they don't allow a single species, say downy brome, to take hold and to take over. And so the more weeds are sort of becoming a new indicator for system health, in the sense that the broader or wider number of species that you have, it can be an indication of how well your system is doing. Because if you can tell, if you have a downy brome problem, that probably tells you something about your rotations. So this is some other work this is from Lyman County. This is from Dwayne Beck, who joined us this afternoon. And they did 15 different rotations here. And I'm showing data from 95, 97, 98, 99, and 2000. What happened to 96? Hail, okay. So that was a year off. But a really nice trend came out of this, and what they're showing, and this is again, impact on winter wheat. So alternate year was their lowest yields. And then as you can see, as you come 2 years out, 2 years in, 2 years out, and 3 years out, you get increasing yields. Some of these we can talk a bit more about from the Dakota Lakes studies, but some of these are a little bit suspect in terms of their cover on the ground. Soybeans, peas. If you've worked with those, you know that there's not a lot left after you're done with harvest. So there's an issue of how much carbon is going back into the ground. So this is another study. This is from Dakota Lakes this time, showing two different rotations. So there's a wheat broadleaf, corn broadleaf, that's in the red here. And again, wheat yields are on the y-axis. And then wheat, corn, and peas. Couple time frames that I think that really highlight some of the differences in these two rotations. 2002 was a pretty dry year. 2006 was a pretty dry year. And you can see there's quite a difference here in yields between those two rotations. Otherwise, not so different, but they found that that particular rotation, higher carbon rotation, had a much higher yield potential even during the drought years. So I put this in here, 69 bushels in that wheat corn broadleaf, or which is wheat corn pea, or the wheat broadleaf, corn broadleaf. So 5 bushels difference overall, but really where it shines in this particular study is in those dry years. And so one thing that Dwayne had noted is that they found that there's a lot of development of platiness in that wheat broadleaf rotation. And platiness, you often find it in compacted soils, but you know, you have your granular structure, and the platiness essentially is where they flatten out and they start to look like plates. And so you get reduced infiltration and low water retention capacity. And so it's probably not an issue of compaction in this case, but probably just a lack of carbon to hold on to that soil structure. So I guess the other take home here is that just because you have a diverse rotation, 4 crops in that case, does not necessarily mean that it's the best rotation. Because it's you know, what they're finding, I think over the long term, is that carbon percent, if it's high carbon versus low carbon, and Tance mentioned it, you got your broadleaves versus your grasses, cool season, warm season, but now we're looking at high carbon versus low carbon. And it corresponds. I mean, your high carbon crops are your grasses mostly, and your low carbon crops are typically your broadleaves. So what they're finding, I think, is that you have a lot more stability within your system when you're adding 70%, 75% high carbon versus low carbon crops. So the problem with that is you can't have a 3-crop rotation and get 70% high carbon unless they're all high carbon. So there's a lot of troubleshooting, I guess I would say, and it depends on where you are. I think out here in Wall, we're drier than Pierre most of the time. And so the carbon, it's hard to move the needle on that a lot of times. But I still think if you start to expand out these rotations, there's a lot of potential. The other issue with a wheat corn pea, any thoughts on that rotation? What might be problematic about that? Especially from the peas perspective? If none of you grow peas, then I'll give you a pass, but yeah. Oh, okay. It's just a very tight rotation. Peas are susceptible to diseases, so 2 years out of peas is difficult for peas. I think it's better to go 4, and some people say 5 or 6. I think you can get away with it out here for a while because it's dry enough that you don't get a lot of those foliar diseases, but eventually I think it'll probably catch up to you on that tight of a rotation. Let me see. So I guess just a few, I better wrap it up here pretty quick.
We have a few minutes.
Okay. George and I said 3 o'clock, or 2 o'clock.
Yeah, I did build just a little extra time in, so you know, if you took another 5 minutes, you'd be okay.
Okay.
A point on that 3-way, Chris, and that's where you get a lot of your trial. We run that as a 6. We have 3 fields, but we run it as a 6-way, so it's wheat, sorghum, pea, wheat, corn, oilseed, so canola or flax, which also have issues with tight rotation. So what we're doing there is making it actually 6 years, so we're keeping those rotations on the broadleaf wide, not necessarily the wheat, but the broadleaf.
Yeah. So, and I think, I think just to extend out that when you're thinking about rotations, extend it out to one more category of high carbon, low carbon, including with your warm season, cool season, broadleaf grasses. So a couple wrapping up points here. Long rotations are really difficult in this climate, especially for our broadleaves. Markets are the issue, obviously. But to be profitable and to be sustainable, it depends on how you define your plant diversity. Kind of just said this, high carbon versus low carbon. Shared pest hosts, that's why we usually don't put wheat after corn. Most of you know that. But also, what other, when you're expanding out these rotations, what other crops do you have shared pests? You know, grass to grass, broadleaf to broadleaf. New windows to control pests, which I talked about. Pests in this case, probably more weeds. We have a lot more options when you expand it out. And so again, the time when you look back at the physiology of those weeds, the time to do that is not in the same with the crop with the same physiology. And opportunities to integrate livestock. You know, Tance mentioned it earlier. We're doing this some on our farm where we're working with integrating livestock as an annual forage. And so let's say you had that wheat corn, or corn could be synonymous with sorghum in most cases, and sorghum might be preferable out here at times. But let's say you take that 3-crop rotation and you expand it out one more year and put in an annual forage. We did that this past 2 years on our farm, and we're following that forage with wheat, and we've seen a lot of good benefits, both with a swath graze and just grazing a pretty broad a mix of cover crops. So another one that I suspect, Ruth, you thought I would talk about probably is the peas. And so out here in Wall area, we've been working a lot with the Eisenbrauns. And so we typically run Pea Trials every year out in this area. And this is actually from our Sturgis farm. This is what it looks like this year. This is our yields. And these are a whole bunch of different peas. But the point is, you know, this year you might have noticed it was kind of a tough year. 24 bushels was our average, but you can see within those varieties there's lots of differences, as you might expect. And so I think spring peas are a viable crop in many cases. Where you sell them is always the question. Out here, you know, I know Purus is one option. I know there's some others that you can take yourself, and because that's on a contract basis. But there are some options, but you know, you have to do the math to figure out if that works. Certainly the crop works, and they're a great rotational crop, especially in a wheat-based system. One other thing that we've been looking at a little bit in the past 2 years is winter peas. Sometimes, you know, we don't think of it this way, but if you're planting a crop, say winter wheat, that's planted in the fall, you're functionally serving, it serves the same functional purpose in many ways as a cover crop that's planted following a wheat harvest. And so one of my goals is to get more winter crops out there. And so we're testing new crops that can survive our winters. So winter peas, these are, you know, functionally they're the same crop as the spring peas, just like winter wheat and spring wheat. But they're a lot more hardy. And so our yields were actually a little bit lower, 19 bushels per acre. I will say, though, that, you know, some of that is probably our fault. The weed control is a little more difficult in fall planted peas. You know, peas, one thing that I think people learn pretty quick is to get ahead of the weeds, you have to control them the year before. And so, like in North Dakota, for example, they're putting down Valor or Spartan or whatever in the fall, and then using that residual and maybe coming and applying a different chemistry in the spring, or just split applying those fall and spring. So the weed control issue is really can be problematic, because your in-season weed control in peas is not great. There are a few, but they're expensive and their efficacy is kind of spotty. And so that is an issue here. We got kind of eaten up by prickly lettuce in this case. But it was also dry and they didn't canopy as well. But anyway, the whole point is they survived. So that was our first question. Can they survive our winters? And so there are new varieties that are coming online, and so I think this could be a potential option for folks that, or even if it's a forage crop, if you can plant it in the fall, that has a lot of advantages as well. And you know, the grain itself is 23, 25, 26 protein. Soybeans, you know, they're in 30s, but it's still a pretty nutrient-rich product, and it's pretty low input. There's the protein here. Yeah, so 26 to 28%. We were just looking at nitrogen fixation. I won't really focus on this. They are a legume, of course. They fix their own nitrogen as long as you inoculate them. And, yeah, so a couple things I wanted to mention. First off, Winter Roadshow is coming to the 17th. That sounds really exciting when they call it a Winter Roadshow. And it is exciting. But this will be our first event at the Sturgis Research Farm. So I just wanted to put it out there. Tance will be joining us, and Pat will be there as well. So please come and join us. Lots of speakers fill out the day. Saline soils, we have a lot of funding to looking at growing crops that grow in salty soils. So if anyone has a great plot, like an acre of salty land, please come and talk to me. We'd be interested in utilizing it. It sounds like an oxymoron to say a great plot of salty land, but for research purposes it is. And then lastly, we're hiring a research technician, so full-time. If anyone knows of anybody looking for work, we need some good farm folks to help us out. So I think that's it. Yep. I'll go ahead and quit there. Questions?
There's a cake plant.
Do we need to get him a microphone?
You can just.
Yeah.
Sorry.
There's a cake plant in Laurel that buys peas.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's good to know. And we actually sold some peas to the co-op in Sturgis as well. I don't know.
Chris Alliance, Nebraska too, is
An alliance? Yeah, so they're out. The options are out there. I don't know if they have certain allotments that they'll take, and then how much they'll take. But certainly, I think there are some, like you said, there are some opportunities there. Good.
How many trials have you done on that winter peas? First year?
That's our second year. So we're in our third year right now.
Does spring peas usually out yield winter peas, or?
Yeah, they have so far. But like I said, I think part of that is just us trying to figure out how to grow them. And that weed control issue remains an issue. But yeah, so I think though, they've been, the best performers have been relatively comparable, but we have a lot more variability within our winter peas.
I saw the planting date for winter peas was October 6th. Is that why that much later than winter peas?
Yeah, Dwayne and I kind of debated this about how to do that, because there's no really solid data on how to do that. And so the thinking there was, let's push it a little bit later. One, because I suspect people would plant their winter wheat first anyway. But two, we thought maybe it'd be less to have less above ground biomass susceptible to the frost and everything over the winter. And so that was the basic logic there. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but so it seems to work okay. And we did do some dormant planting in February, and the yields were similar. So we also, that's a potential for those as well.
The B&W, where they grow their things, they try to plant them. They try to plant them so they don't come up in the fall, but they're just ready to break ground. Once they get up, then they become more long and stuff. I think that's what we were talking about trying to do, is to plant them late enough that they just barely come up. But central part of South Dakota, when is that? Depends on how long it stays nice and fall.
Right. I think the first frost there this year was into November. First major frost, anyway.
We've also looked a lot at winter canola, which is equally frustrating.
You were planting that a lot earlier though, right?
Well, winter canola, you want it to get up and form a big crown.
Yeah.
But you need to form that crown close to the soil surface, so it's tricky to put it into residue and have to do that. It'll usually put the crown too high. But we've done all this stuff with row cleaners and everything, but it still is marginal or unpredictable.
Any other questions?
Great, thanks.